Okay.
The 9-year-old is open to suggestions. She or he has the necessary logic to create the abstract concept involved. She or he has the ability to entertain any state in a continuum of possible states as equally valid, and she or he can operate on concrete information according to suggestions for such operation if she or he is ever lucky enough to receive any. The 9-year-old's worldview has not completely hardened. His or her capacities will remain somewhat open until adolescence. In this plastic stage, she or he can certainly accept the idea that a fork can just be as easily be a bent, broken, twisted, or altered fork if she or he sees it done. This is immediately an idea for his or her entertainment. The suggested pattern can easily be extracted from the given pattern in the brain, according to the nature of the suggestion. The operation can easily find a sufficient number of points of similarity. The related information from the source of stimulus, that fork itself, is then operated on by this newly created and arbitrary pattern, changing that information.
Shivangla, you're very soft.
One second.
Okay, and the word was entrainment, not so that the brain gets entrained to accept that yes, the fork can bend.
That entertainment time.
Hmm. Okay, entertainment, I would equate it with entrained.
Okay. One second. The fact that the source of the sensory stimulus, the fork, changes in this Geller effect introduces new considerations. When the abstract idea operates on the incoming information, the operation changes not only the information but also the source of information. The Balinese child's ability to walk on coals can be attributed to subjective reactions, whatever that might mean. We can see how the body might be so influenced that it does not register pain in the usual way and somehow is not injured as a result. We have heard of Eastern fakirs lying on beds of nails and so on. Research into pain has changed some of our assumptions. On the other hand, the Geller child are not being subjective. Objects change. The material substance of the world matrix gets altered, and at times the object just disappears outright. This is what has equally altered the sure academic attitudes of Josephson, Taylor, and many others.
Okay, so what happens many times is the object actually disappears and will appear somewhere else. So this transference also takes place many times.
There is no return to the state from which the operation of mind begins. That possible state has altered the original. Fire walking is one order of phenomena, causing a metal rod sealed inside a glass tube to tie itself in knots is another. The Geller children have done a great deal of this. Both are examples of concrete operational thinking in which the child's logic operates on reality information and changes that information. In the imitative play of childhood, the child mirrors with his body the body movements of the model. The world is not assimilated to this accommodation. A one-way effect is played on. It is no way affects either child or world, except to give the child a desired play, reality, and furnish his conceptual machinery its nutrients for world structuring. In firewalking, creative logic may reverse things. The world may assimilate and accommodate to the model, the child. When the operation of mind is over, the basic set of world concepts is there, functioning as it always has and always will. Nothing has changed. The fire certainly does not change among a group walking it. Some may be burned, others not. The world concepts accommodate to the personal act, and the reality of world plus person has been correspondingly changed as needed in that moment and context. This is what the division of labor in the mind-brain system is designed to do. Both processes, earth as itself and person as individual expression, function smoothly within the mind-brain system in an easy symbiotic relation. Thus, the earth achieves her goal of moving beyond her own limitations. An 11-year-old Japanese Jun Sekiguchi bent a spoon suspended by wire in a sealed plastic container by willing it to bend. He made a spoon in the bottom of a basin of water, bend without touching it. He threw a spoon into the air, at which point it twisted into a spiral shape. He threw pieces of straight wire into the air, and as they fell, they twisted to form the name of the man running the experiment. None of this was premeditated. It was all random play on the part of the boy. Only the adult experimenters are so deadly serious. The children find it all hilarious, beaming, smirking, laughing, delighted at each success, and a bit bewildered. English children, investigated by John Taylor, bent metal by stroking it gently with one finger. A 12-year-old girl made a 40-degree bend in a chrome plate steel bar by stroking it. An identical bar required 500 pounds of mechanical pressure to bend it in similar fashion. The metal strips that double up into odd shapes inside sealed glass tubes are not touched. The children simply run their hands over the tubes. Metal is the usual medium for experiment because wood or plastic items tend to disintegrate or explode.
Yeah, so it's much more difficult to bend plastic than to bend steel or metal.
When Geller visited John Taylor's laboratory in London in June 1974, Taylor had prepared some carefully designed experiments. One involved a pressure measuring device costing some $600 to construct. The test involved having Geller simply hold the device as the experiment proceeded. As soon as Geller took the device, however, its interior crumbled. Although Taylor quickly seized it, the central diaphragm had disintegrated within about 10 seconds. The investment was soon in ruins, and the experiment was a failure. During the same morning, several pieces of copper plate disappeared, only to reappear in another area of the building. Two of the objects struck Taylor on the back of the legs as he and Geller walked down the hall some 70 feet from where Taylor had last placed them. These latter episodes fall into the category of poltergeist or playful poltergeist.
But it's basically poltergeistic things which happen.
Or playful spirit phenomena reported through the ages.
So there are many videos of seances also taking place where actually cutlery etc. fall out of the air onto the table. The same thing happens in those sessions also.
Such phenomena have traditionally broken around early adolescence, just at the period when suggestibility and concrete operations begin to phase out, to the stage-specific learnings of adolescence when such abilities atrophy and disappear if they have gone undeveloped. From age 7 to about age 14 or 15 is the period the biological plan prepares for this learning and development.
So again, if the children stop using that ability, then they will not be able to use it anymore.
Uri Geller reports his first phenomena of this sort occurred when he was 7. The phenomena broke into Matthew Manning's life at age 11. The reason for this random part of appearance is hard to determine. The reason why enculturation is more or less effective in varying degrees is hard to say. Research shows that all known psychics received accidental electric shock in childhood, but this is inconclusive. In ordinary successful enculturation, Anxiety conditioning systematically screens out each of the bondings and abilities involved as they appear. In concrete operations, we are dealing with the relation between a primary process and the individual selective consciousness. The primary process encompasses the flow, the world, and the physical body. The young person relates to his or her primary processing in the same way the child relates to his or her mother as she or he builds a knowledge of the world. When the pre-adolescent's relation with the earth matrix remains in natural balance, a dynamic interaction exists automatically and non-consciously. To initiate an active conscious and selective relation, however, the child must be given his or her initial suggestions for the possibilities. His or her intent still must be given in its content from without in order to be brought from potential to actuality. Once the child learns to activate his or her creative relations, she or he can determine some line of action that then gives the cue around which his or her primary process and creative logic can organize. An abstract possibility, one coming not from the world but from the mind, can then be extracted out of the given world concept and a new reality experience can be created. Surely all biological organisms exist by interaction between organism and earth, and there is no way to separate the earth from its life. Earth is the planet that lives, that has a 27-day cycle of temperature change, that has, that has a circulation system for its water, that breathes, that constructs radiation belts to protect its life, that thinks as Teilhard de Chardin claimed. Seawater cannot be duplicated in a laboratory because it is not just water and salt or this or that, but rather a living ecosystem in which the millions of different organisms are all part of the living substance. Separate it, separate its life from its water, and you no longer have seawater. The assimilation accommodation between earth and creature. The lowly slime mold forms a colony on the forest floor that changes the chemical nature of the ground beneath and the atmosphere immediately above. The colony creates a unique environment, a life envelope in which assimilation and accommodation are made by both earth and mold. The mold exists by the grace of the earth's accommodation, just as the earth is a living earth because of creatures such as the slime mold. As you move up the life scale, you move up a scale of complexity of assimilation accommodation. The earth is always accommodating to the organisms she assimilates, and that must assimilate and accommodate to her. No dividing line exists between earth and creature. Remove the creature and earth is a dead rock. With the human being, the earth's most complex organism, this interaction is as extended and complex as the thought process involved. In firewalking, we have accommodation to the creature through the principles by which the earth operates. In the Geller effect, when metal is transformed without the usual cause-effect mechanisms, some particular object of the earth is assimilated to an idea, and that object accommodates to that idea. There is no break in the continuity and logical flow of the entire life process, from seawater, slime mold, chimpanzee to jeller child bending a spoon by thinking. All we are dealing with is assimilation, accommodation among parts of a living hologram. With the division of labor in the mind-brain system, the possibilities for interaction of such an infinitely complex system become open-ended. That the earth, functioning through and as the child's primary process, should accommodate to her most complex creature according to the nature of that creature's structure is logical and rational. Yet, precisely at this point of the reversibility of the ordinary flow of assimilation accommodation, the academic stronghold rises to reject the phenomena. The entire history of Western man rests on the unquestioned assumption that the mind brain is a one-way receptor of information from its world. designed only to interpret and react in adaptive ways to this information. And the only adaptive ways academically recognized and allowed are those using mechanical devices or ineffectual muscular defense stances. This institutionalized belief that the mind has absolutely no influence over or relation to its world except through dominating tools has now created a nuclear terror, reducing everyone to total impotence and fate. We deny our true nature at our peril because such denials always creates a demonic counter energy of destruction. The crux of our social stance is entirely and squarely this issue of our relation, of our mind and our reality, our world and our created experience. At age 7, with his or her world structure largely roughed in and his or her concrete matrix established, the child system moves towards abstractions on that concreteness and will become organized around whatever suggestions for that abstractions she or he is offered and can assimilate. The flow of interaction between child and matrix is the relation among concept sets or ways for processing information. Abstract concepts can be created in the brain just as they can be drawn out of concrete concepts. Then these patterns can extract accordingly and synthesize experiences outside the world as it is. Abstractions can play on the principles and natural laws of cause and effect as needed. Ordinary effects of the world can be suspended according to the needs and well-being of the particular person in that person's immediate life envelope. Then the person can operate on and change his context if needed, walk on a bed of fire and not be burned, or alter the shape of a potential harm. When the synthetic concepts of operational thinking complete their activity and the worldview resumes its concrete activity, a stress relaxation cycle has been completed. The child's muscular mindedness to enter into stress relaxation of this type leads to autonomy. She or he learns that the world matrix meets him her halfway and augments his or her energy with its own. Doctor Joel Witten of Toronto found in his work with Matthew Manning that the old brain, cerebellum and brainstem seems to be involved in the actual psychokinesis displayed by Manning. Witten writes that psychic functions are not a higher or different degree of concentration, but an unknown or outside force that creates it. Because of the involvement of older brain parts, Witten suggests that the psychic functions are not random gifts or space-age abilities, but an innate function and ability in Homo sapiens that probably goes back to the earliest history of man. Perhaps our myths are correct and our problem is one not of evolving a higher mentality, but of reclaiming our lost state. Witten's comment is of interest to me because I have suggested in my earlier book, The Crack in the Cosmic Egg, that non-ordinary phenomena and primary perceptions would be found to center in older brain functions. Right-left hemispheric activity cannot account for our most creative interplays. Some of our greatest acts lie not in brain computing alone, but in interaction with the total life system. Although all the brain systems are involved in any activity, the nature of the activity determines which brain function dominates. The older brain system, pre-programmed by our genetic plan from the beginning, apparently gives us our creative interactions with the living earth, and so is one of our greatest avenues of expression. Pausing with me, then, to consider these 3 billion years of genetic experimenting leading to the human being, moving from concreteness towards abstraction through thousands of experimental species to achieve a logic that can conceptualize with unlimited flexibility an intelligence that can move through infinite realms of content. The more it knows, the more it can know, and a means of survival beyond species survival, a personal survival needed by the kind of individual resulting from the development of such an intelligence. Having those eons of effort, passing all notions of time as we use the word, had as the goal of this greatest expression magical parlor tricks. Bending spoons. Every movement, every random effect in the development has purpose and design. What then is the purpose of altering the principles and or parts of the world itself? These capacities are the logical extension of play, and play is in the service of survival. Survival play is not developed, of course, and a phenomenon occurs in the children of all cultures somewhere between 8 and 10 years of age, right in the middle of this concrete stage, a phenomenon that shatters the young life yet receives scant attention. Quietly forming below awareness is a conceptual structure that surfaces as an exquisitely silent anguish hidden beyond discussion or clarification. The awareness that one must die. The concept of death as one's personal destiny with no possibility of evasion unfolds as a function somewhere around age 9. Concepts structure information into meaning regardless of the nature of the concept, and this concept changes everything. Once filtered through this particular abstraction, experience is never again the same. Play disappears and becomes intentional and competitive. The self tries to take over the conceptual work beneath, and childhood dies.
Okay, anything, anyone? So it's basically building up the matrix, okay, from one to the other.
Chapter 18 towards autonomy, splitting the brain. Every move that follows intent is adaptive, even that waste of time called play. Development moves towards autonomy, the intelligence to survive. This ability unfolds and operates on two levels: the conscious conceptual work within the hologram brain and the conscious self playing on the surface of it. The ability to play on the surface depends on the success of the work beneath, which depends on the success of the play. When play on the surface is finally destroyed and work on the surface becomes the aware self's drive, the inner work of intelligence breaks down and the synergy of the system collapses. Anxiety takes over, joy disappears, and the avoidance of death becomes the central issue of life. That is, we grow up.
So work, if you can enjoy your work, whatever you do, whatever you're doing, that really helps. This is the same thing that Shivendraji was saying today in the talk, that you have to enjoy what you do. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Just as most children learn to walk and get that out of the way before learning to talk, the biological plan strives to get physical learning accomplished and out of the way so that more abstract learning might take place. And in the economy of nature, physical learning provides the transition kinds of concrete abstractions needed to move into full abstract thinking. The physical learning nature expects from the child of 7 to about 11 is the art of physical survival, moving his or her body successfully through the tangible living world. Success is physical learning means a complete enough competence to allow the automatic controls of the old brain system to take over, freeing intelligence for about more abstract matters. Complete physical competence involves not just muscular competence and body prowess, but intellectual competence in handling concrete operational thinking. Only through both can physical well being and security in the world be assured. And until these critical items are assured, intelligence cannot turn such functions over to more automatic controls. Then these late childhood concerns become the lifelong concerns of an intelligence designed for far greater maturities. All possibilities for abstraction tend to be used for this most concrete and immature need. Intelligence tries to cope with survival while also trying to move ahead with the biological programming and respond to the inner talent for development. Somewhere around age 9, The biological plan provides that the child should begin to assume responsibility for his or her own survival. By then, she or he should have had 2 years of modeling and training in the uses of concrete operational thought for survival, as well as the general education of the body. The tragedy is that we learn nothing about survival during this critical period. Instead, we learn a concept of death as practiced and perpetuated by our culture. Failure to develop the intellectual tools for survival leads to anxiety, just as failure to bond with the mother matrix leads to anxiety in infancy and childhood. Autonomy unfolds out of the logic of differentiation and gives an awareness of separation and independence, whether or not any ability to deal with that independence has developed. When unprepared for, independence is sensed by the child as isolation and abandonment. Just as the conditionally bonded 4-year-old will have nightmares when individuation begins, the unprepared self feels anxiety at the final functional separation from primary processing or earth matrix. At this point, it is nature's design to bond and give creative relationship and freedom. But for the unprepared self, the harsh bonds with anxiety deepen. Just when its brain has been prepared for new learning and cued to look for models to develop physical survival, the child is exposed to the cultural concept of death. This concept is an idea system concerning survival in the general, physical, species, and personal. It is an abstraction drawn from abstractions, an idea system growing out of other idea systems going back into prehistory. The idea system has no relation to reality other than the semantic reality it creates, and it offers no techniques at all for actual survival on any level. In fact, the concept of death is a fabric woven of our historical anxiety over having no true technique for survival. History may have begun such a short time back when we lost the capacity for survival, and it has been nothing less than the account of the tragedy than befalling us. Then befalling us. Because we fail to develop our genetically given tools for survival, we develop anxiety systems of ideas for possible survival instead. The culture's body of knowledge then arises as the ongoing outgrowth of the concept of death. This body of knowledge is the only thing offered the child as any model for survival. It holds the hopes or pseudo promises that tools for survival may somehow emerge by serving the idea systems, making up that body of knowledge. In nearly all cultures, the child makes some sort of transition from parent to culture at around age 7. Cultural training in the body of knowledge then begins in order to do two things. First, it moves to break up the natural bonding to the world, scheduled to unfold and fully cement at this period, and enforces instead a bonding to culture. That is, the body of knowledge with its institutions and priesthoods becomes the surrogate matrix presented to the child as the only safe space and source of strength and possibility, which of course the living earth alone actually is. Second, this cultural bonding interprets training as instruction in the use of the tools of that culture, both the physical tools of its technology and the mental tools for learning its body of language necessary for developing those mechanical tools. A concept of death and actual survival ability have no more in common than society and culture have. Failure to develop survival learning leads to the adoption of a concept of death, just as failure to maintain society breeds the legal system of culture. And of course, the two go hand in glove. The concept of death conditions one to believe that the greatest chance of forestalling or avoiding death is through success within the institutions that promise death avoidance. Our life's image is then locked into sustaining and perpetuating that chosen institution, which can be sustained only by blocking to the natural capacity for survival and by maintaining anxiety. To the pre-logical child, death is as different from death to adult logic as the child's play reality is different from the adult work reality. No adult logic concerning the death of the body has meaning to the pre-logical child. That child is as yet undifferentiated from the primary process. Such an egocentric self cannot die in the same sense that the grown and isolated self does. An awareness that this is not yet articulated from the general awareness cannot comprehend the subject object split that makes an individual death. Death means disappearance to the child. That which was here is gone. Adult descriptions of why a death took place, what the death means, or even how the death took place will be lost on the child. Such descriptions come only after from the adult idea systems, all of which are abstractions, having at best only some tenuous threads to the child's immediate concreteness. The child may agree with and even echo the mouthings of adult logic because she or he is geared to follow cues, and children catch the drift of adult dramatics without grasping the logic. But to think that this agreement means understanding is an error. Few researchers have been able to get around the block of their own logic and find out what a child says about death. Furthermore, adult bias influences the whole set of a child's response. Adult concepts of death are verbal construction, product of, and subject to the continual metaphoric mutation within our thinking. In one part of the world, death takes place because of demons. In another, because of ghost enemies, as in the case with the New Guinea tribe that strangely has no belief in an afterlife, yet is terrified of the ghost of a newly dead person, or because God wills it, dumping the bad on God, or because of de- demon germs that go bump in the night with our destruction as their evil intent. The game of peekaboo, which infants loved from the very early age, originally meant alive or dead. That which disappears is dead. Object permanence occurs when the infant's logic retains knowledge that something is still there, even when it is not present to the senses. A kind of confused correlation of this is found in the middle childhood period when the child grasps death as disappearance and yet does not grasp the irrevocable nature of the disappearance. The child employs a kind of ninth move logic, shifting ground readily in some makeshift structure. As Rocklin's study showed that the child is questioned by an adult about death, the question framed by and within adult logic and the answer framed by and within pre-logic indicate mostly the differences of logic and very little child's about the child's concept of death. But surely you don't think the dead person still sees? One researcher asked a 5-year-old. The child answered, no, they can't see, poor things. It's dark in those coffins. But then at night, when they come outside, they can see then, but not so well. If a death occurs to one in the child's bond, particularly a parent, that death is interpreted by the child as abandonment. No reason for the abandonment can be given this pre-reasoning child that can in any way mitigate or explain the disappearance. The dread of abandonment grows whenever the bond with the parents is weak. This dread then becomes attached to his or her ideas about death as disappearance. The dread of abandonment comes from premature autonomy being forced on the child. That is when the parents make the child aware of and feel responsible for his or her own survival. Premature autonomy and survival concerns lead to rapid formation of a concept of death. Anger is the most destructive force a child knows, and the cultural child develops the idea that a person's death means that someone was angry with that person. Death is also seen as retribution. The person who has died must have done something very bad. The death of a sibling can often causes severe guilt because a child often wishes for the death of interfering brother or sister. If the sibling then dies, the child then can feel secretly responsible and worries that she or he will be paid back, as one child expressed it, or will him or herself be caused to disappear. The death of a parent is a double bind guilt to the acculturated child. She feels that his or her inevitable death wishes towards the parents for obstructing him or her have suddenly taken effect, and she or he immediately simultaneously undergoes the trauma of abandonment. The child feels that the parent has willfully abandoned him or her, even though she or he believes that it is his or her fault. The idea of death as permanent and irrevocable is beyond the grasp of the child, whose time is always now, whose place is here, whose world radiates out from him or her, and who is still an integral part of the general flow. Disappearance always has a cause, as in the belief that a parent's death is willful abandonment, and the child fills in the gaps of his or her logic as best as she or he can. His or her pre-logic is in no way an evasion by one part of the mind of the real understanding in some other part of his or her awareness. Such studies as Lauchlin's, interpreting the child's answers as the willful logic of the child's self-evasion, hiding understanding from conscious awareness, refusing to admit that she or he really knows, are silly and superficial. The child is not hiding from the grim facts when she or he gives such outlandish reasons. She or he is responding as best as he can to highly loaded and emotionally cued questions. The difference lies not in truth, but in logical processing of information, including the nature of the adult's questions and the child's processing of it. Sorry. There are many reasons why death cannot mean to the pre-logical child what it means to an adult. The death of a pre-logical child is not the same event as the death of a fully individuated person. Physical death and personal death are no more synonymous than world and reality experience. Adult notions of death hinge heavily on being cut off from awareness of the primary process. Furthermore, a concept of death is a construct of verbal logic. The average pre-logical child has no capacity for handling high-level verbal abstractions. Thus, such a concept cannot begin construction until some ability for abstraction unfolds and is developed. Long before this development, though, the child has absorbed most of the elements of the culture's death concept. It is there, roughed in, ready for the maturation of the necessary logic to act on it and complete it. All the free-floating anxieties of childhood accumulate in a critical mass at about age 9. Then the logical ability unfolds and the mind-brain makes the ordering of this pattern once it has been given the necessary clues to the nature of that organization. During the pre-logical period, concern over personal survival occurs only when the bonding is conditional, incomplete, or broken. The securely bonded child would never conceive of survival concerns. Nature provides the child's long dependency precisely so that the parents will assume responsibility for his or her survival and leave the child's system open and free for exploration and construction. Nature provides that the child should not become aware of his or her own survival needs, that is, of death as personal, until she or he has the tools for survival. Nor does nature mock her children. In the millennia of history, a considerable percentage of children may have died within the first 5 years of life through natural selection, the gaining of immunities, and general adaptations, but to program a full conscious knowledge of one's own death into the early years before any possible techniques of survival could be developed would be cruel, unnecessary, and stupid. The magical child's awareness of death unfolds in late childhood in the form of the child driving desire for autonomy and awareness of being responsible for his or her own survival. If the child has been given the proper education in survival, this expresses itself as design, a period of intensive and ecstatic play in which varying the possibilities of one's survival tools are explored, in which concrete operational thinking and enhancement of primary perceptions are practiced. This would mean confrontation, the child actively seeking tests of his or her prowess. Is this the education he receives? Of course not. At this most critical time, we slap the child into the anxiety ridden and frightful experience of schooling. For the newly born individual system, this is the equivalent of a violent birth, and the results are pretty much a repetition of that earlier trauma: brain damage, shock, intellectual crippling, and an overall depression that becomes permanent. The great promise with which the child was born is now shattered completely. Each generation produced under schooling proves more shocked, crippled, violent, aggressive, hostile, confused, defiant, despairing, and the social body crumbles faster and faster. And increasingly, our reflexive conditions answer is to inflict the tragedy on the child sooner and sooner, in the hope that if we catch him or her early enough, it will all work out. Should we as a species survive our current destructive course, this period of history will be looked upon as a time of delusion and madness, far eclipsing the blackest period of the Dark Ages. The child is doubly caught because schooling has its roots anxiety over survival. And this web of anxiety is also all that is offered for the child for modeling at this critical period of the survival drive. The child must attend the culture's body of knowledge. If she or he cannot grasp its content and win applause, she or he will still grasp its attention and lose to anxiety, because what is offered is proclaimed true by parents and superiors. And because there is a system of reward and punishment for success or failure in it, the child has no choice except fall in line. To refuse is to face abandonment by parents and society at large, to have no place left to turn to. Conceptual structuring takes place below the level of awareness, according to the experience furnishing the content. No human would ever willfully construct a concept of death or willfully inflict it on another, because this concept presents the entire universe, the life system itself, the world and nature as the enemy. The primary process, one of the three principal functions of the brain system, becomes the dread adversary to be outwitted, avoided, predicted, and controlled by that pitifully inadequate and anxiety driven social self. The death concept represents the greater part of the child's own self as the antagonist. His or her newly functional, impressionable, and vulnerable self system is taught to believe that the matrix itself is the enemy. Even the physical body is depicted as that which must be dominated, outwitted, predicted, and controlled if the individual self is to survive. The division of labor has presented a new personality to the world, only to have that world represented by adult caretakers as hostile and violent, as indeed it then is as a result of the culture's practice. Then the limited either or logic of analysis is held to be the only reliable tool available to the child for surviving the adversary world. Life is represented to us as our death, and our analytic brain, only able to pull things apart, is represented as our life. Examine the roots of every cultural institution and profession: medicine, the military, politics, advertising, television, schooling, life insurance. Surely the strangest euphemism ever coined: lawyers, police, news media, weather forecasters, technology as a whole. At the root of any cultural subsystem lies death, the fear, avoidance, and outwitting of death. Death as a loss of anxiety reducing possessions, love, youthful looks, vigor, sex, appeal, job, security, health, soul, country, and so on and on. Each system survives by either robbing us of our birthright and then selling it back to us, or threatening us and then selling us escape from the threat. The concept of death is a semantic structure. Studies indicate that the so-called dominant hemisphere of brain, the one running the right hand, is the vehicle for this kind of analytical cause-effect thinking. Historically, only this kind of thinking has been considered right. Other types of thinking should be left strictly alone. Right thinking expresses itself in concrete evaluation. Reacting to a situation of threat is suited to this right-handed thinking, and expresses itself in overt acts that are susceptible to social judgment. Some societies actually tied children's left hands behind their backs to assure their adherence to right-handed dominance and thus cultural thought. Left-handed thinking relates to the primary process, the flow of things, and expresses itself through unity and bonding to the earth. Cultural priests can neither predict nor control a person who operates from left-handed thinking. Left-handed thinking has traditionally been considered the weak, threatening, and feminine, exposing male dominance of culture, which is to say that the left hand has been historically associated with death. Myth and religion are full of left-right imagery, most of which reverses the cultural representations, that is, the left is the true life and the right is the broad leading to destruction. In Norse mythology, the god Odin found the secret spring of wisdom and poetry and asked the guardian of the spring for a drink. The guardian replied, "The price is your right eye." Jesus said, "If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, cut it off." He said nothing of the left hand, for it represents the flow, the Tao, the father or mother, depending on your culture. The Taoists, with their yin-yang symbol, the black being the feminine, the white masculine, understood the true relationship. Each had the other within. Each existed only in balance with the other. Each arose out of the other. The structuring of the concept of death takes place in the child unconsciously as a result of non-conscious cueing towards survival. In forced learning of anxiety idea systems and premature abstract learning discussed in chapter 19. This concept is the only survival means then available, and once formed, it operates on all information about the world. Later, all the inner dialogue going on in the head will generate around this concept and its manifold content, because concept always functions as concept, a pattern for putting together information. And because survival is the issue of this concept, and the concept represents the flow of life as the enemy, all information coming in is subject to its filtering and its shape all information from the world according to potential danger or hostility. The final value. To the primary process, and old brain functions within the mind brain system, this verbal construct poses a problem. The primary process in the brain is the hologram of the macrocosm. It cannot function as designed and at the same time filter its own function through a conceptual pattern that represents its unifying creative actions as the arch adversary. The death concept represents the unified flow as dangerous and the artificial constructs of the culture's body of knowledge and tool capacity as offering the only safe space. How then could bonding with the earth, the matrix of all matrices, possibly take place at age 7? How could there be anything but bonding to culture? Because the primary process is both the larger part of the child system and the universal flow of things, a paradox ensues. The only solution, if the organism is to continue functioning, is to prematurely transfer all this kind of semantic logic to the dominant hemisphere, the area specializing in analytic thought and orienting to social relations, whence the concept came, through the division of labor within the brain. Then the subdominant hemisphere and old brain can continue to function according to plan, which means keeping the organism actually alive and functioning on the earth. So, somewhere around 9 or 10, language, at least as it is used for propositional logic, becomes the specialty of the dominant hemisphere, along with the volitional decision making of our either or survival logic, which originates in fight flight reactions. The combination of these two effects is overpowering. The child's conscious awareness is literally forced to attend to this system of thought, lock in on the promises that the culture holds for the manipulation of this semantic logic as a way of avoiding anxiety and screen about the older life systems as culture demands. In a neat double bind, the primary process and body knowing are then essentially mute because they do not partake of this analytic nature, partly in order to be free of the concepts semantic logic holds. Meanwhile, schooling, acculturation, throws a continually greater emphasis on semantic structures. The word built world becomes the only harbor for the newly forming independent mind, and social consensus begins to crowd out a criterion of balance within. The result is a neat cleavage, a splitting of the brain without surgery. The self system is pitted against the rest of the brain system. We feel isolated and estranged from our world, the large adversary from which each other, potential adversaries, and even from our own body. By the time the child is 10 or 11, logic has matured sufficiently to handle the premature abstractions that schooling enforces and the problems of premature autonomy brought about by the death concept, but the state-specific period for bonding to the earth and the possibilities for operational relations with that earth begins to fade at age 11 and largely disappears around age 14 or 15. The biological plan moves ahead, and the young person is left to struggle on with only the culture's concept of death and its body of knowledge. After age 11, as new logical shifts take place, logical development depends on internalizing and abstracting speech. At some point during pre-adolescence, words should begin to dissociate fully from the object's name so that the thinking can begin to stand outside concrete thinking and achieve objectivity. A premature disassociation of name and thing named works against the movement from concrete operational thinking towards a purely abstract form of operational thinking. After the child has reached age 11, language is meant to be separated from the body knowing kind of concrete language because by then all concrete learning should have been perfected and become virtually autonomic. But anxiety conditioning has acted on what should have been a natural division, brought it about prematurely, and created a nearly unbridgeable split rather than a separated but functional relation. The cultural reality system is based on a word-built logic with only the most tenuous threads of association with the real world. This semantic reality is extremely unstable. It must be carried in the brain system by only a portion of that system. Yet the young person has no other place to turn. How does the self system try to stabilize its very shaky reality premise built on semantic logic? Through a continual inner play of words or roof brain chatter. A semantic reality is kept intact through unbroken semantic feedback, but the word built world receives like little support from the real world, which is not a semantic proposition. So the person's awareness system becomes one vast arena for internal word arguments. This starts as primary processes fade and give way to the dominance of anxiety, conditioning, and cultural semantics. Autonomy does not develop, it gives way to an awareness of death, conceived by a culture that has not developed a logic of survival, that can never leave the concrete stage that opens at age 7, that develops only its inherited anxiety over having no ability to survive. In such a culture, physical survival and personal survival become as confused as reality, experience, and the world. A common theme in the dreams of 7, 8, and 9-year-olds is death and resurrection in various forms. A theory of ghosts seems to spring up in these children of its own accord. The child concerned over a death in his or her family will often dream that the person returns to him or her and gives the child his or her life energy. Naturally, we dismiss these dreams as psychological compensations for loss or evasive maneuvers to avoid the awful facts the child does not want to face. That is, if the child's dreams take such a constructive, helpful, and optimistic form, they are put into the same category of wish fulfillment as childhood play. Both are considered techniques for avoiding adjustments or adaptation to the harsh realities of life. At least that is how the priests of the anxiety systems view them. Perhaps if we took our cues from our children, we would find that their dreams are trying to tell them something, just as their play tries to tell us something. Children often try to tell us what we, in our blindness and deafness, have so seriously failed to tell them.
I think we can stop. Anything, anyone? I think it's pretty clear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you at 4.
4 o'clock.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Niket ji,
Haji.
I am Smita here. I
Yes,
just
Smita.
want to ask semantic groups. What does it mean, semantic groups?
Where did you read that? Yeah.
Abhi last
Semantic is the when you start feeling the primary feedback is from the earth matrix. Semantic knowledge is from the abstract logic. So the first matrix was the womb. The second
Okay.
matrix became the mother.
Mm.
The third became the primary because that will always be there now. Wherever the guy travels, he's in the primary mechanics of the earth matrix.
Okay. Yeah.
And then it's the semantic matrix where your abstractation starts to take a view. So where he says a semantic reality is kept through unbroken semantic feedback, but the word-built world receives little support from the real world, which is not semantic preposition. So a person's awareness system becomes one vast arena for internal word logic. So you may be imagining something which is not reflected in the real world, and then there is an argument and a discussion. And then you have to create your own reality through an integration of the two. Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
basically, it's a building block. The way that we are growing, we
Mm.
need to understand that one matrix must grow into the other matrix.
Mm.
If one step is missed, then it
Mm.
becomes difficult for assimilation to take place because there is no foundation on which to operate from.
Yeah. Okay. Mm.
Okay, basically that's the game.
Okay. 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 Okay, Nikitji. Thank you.
Okay, Ram
Thank you,
Ram.
Nikitji.
Ram Ram.
Ram Ram.